When you finally walk away from an avoidant, you aren't just creating space, you're detonating a bomb in their carefully constructed emotional world. Let's talk about what's happening beneath the surface. This isn't about mind games or manufactured longing. That's a shallow read. The real mechanics are operating at the level of neurology, deep attachment programming, and the silent agreements that were never voiced but were powerfully enforced. An avoidant doesn't connect like others. They don't find balance through closeness, they find it through regulated distance. Your steady presence was never just about company. It was foundational stability, not because you clung tightly, but because you were reliably there. You were the fixed point that permitted their departures without cost. Unconsciously, your availability became their emotional gyroscope. You were the quiet confirmation whispering, "I can retreat," and the world remains intact. Now, observe what shifts when you vanish. There is no grand scene, no explosive fight, no lengthy justification, just profound absence. And that absence yanks the stabilizer from their entire operating system. The very mechanism that let them sidestep feeling is suddenly offline. Their nervous system, wired for predictability and command, loses its primary reference point. And when an avoidant loses emotional regulation, the body reacts long before the mind can spin a story. That's why they first experience agitation, not sorrow, restlessness, irritability, distraction. They can't concentrate. They reflexively check devices without purpose. Your image drifts into their awareness at random, inconvenient times. This isn't sentimental memory yet. It's biological. The system is in dysregulation. The familiar cadence, approach, retreat, return has been shattered. And the human organism despises broken rhythms. Here's the layer most people miss. Avoidants don't dread intimacy as much as they dread emotional reliance. And your silence manufactures the potential for dependency without their consent. Suddenly they sense the lack of something they never admitted needing. That is profoundly destabilizing because it forces a realization they've devoted a lifetime to evading. I needed this anchor more than I ever let on. When you were present, they could control the narrative, they could downplay, postpone, compartmentalize, but absence obliterates the illusion of control. You cannot regulate what is no longer there. You cannot create distance from an empty void. So the suppressed feelings don't erupt, they seep slowly, quietly. In moments of stillness, they are unequipped to endure. This is why your silence echoes so deafeningly for them. Not because you're penalizing them, but because you've stopped buffering them from their own inner reality. You're no longer absorbing the emotional weight they refuse to carry, and now they must feel it. Not in a flood, but in a persistent drip, enough to cause discomfort, enough to prompt introspection, enough to fracture the defensive armor they built for survival, not for love. Your absence doesn't punish them, it forces a confrontation they've spent a lifetime scheduling for never. And here is where the true power resides. This isn't a debt you owe them. It's a phenomenon that occurs because you finally chose self-regard over endless emotional maintenance. You didn't disappear to provoke a reaction, you disappeared to preserve your essence, and that singular decision inverts the entire dynamic. They are left alone with the one thing avoidants grapple with most, unresolved emotion with no available exit. So if you're questioning why your absence carries more weight than any argument, understand this. Your presence facilitated their avoidance, your absence mandates their confrontation. And for someone who has made a life's work out of fleeing from feeling, being compelled to sit with it is the most potent alarm clock imaginable. Sometimes the most powerful action isn't adding more words, it's removing the very condition that made their avoidance sustainable. Now let's descend to the next psychological tier. This is where the authentic, lasting shift occurs, and it's the part almost everyone misreads. Avoidants do not respond to emotional logic. They do not change because of reasoned discussions, heartfelt promises, or stern ultimatums. They change when reality unplugs their safety net. And that safety net, whether you recognized it or not, was your persistent accessibility. As long as you remained in some form, texting, explaining, hoping, leaving the doorway ajar, you existed in their psyche as an unresolved equation. And unresolved equations don't generate urgency. They manufacture procrastination. The avoidant nervous system is engineered to believe, I'll address this later. Later feels safe. Later feels managed. Later permits them to remain detached without facing immediate consequences. But true absence rewrites the psychological math. When you go quiet without drama, something critical registers in their subconscious. This isn't an intermission. This might be the conclusion. And avoidants only feel the gravity of potential loss when it ceases to feel reversible. The moment your absence carries the tone of finality, the internal emotional clock they've been perpetually postponing starts its countdown. This is when the inner monologue turns inward, not toward missing you, but toward auditing themselves. They begin replaying interactions, not to savor intimacy, but to scan for miscalculations. Did I misread this situation? Did I overstep a boundary I didn't see? Did I assume I had unlimited time? These questions don't spring from romance initially. They erupt from threat assessment. The threat isn't rejection. The threat is forfeiting control over the timeline, because control is the avoidance true attachment dialect. When they can dictate when to engage and when to vanish, they feel secure. But your absence revokes that choice. It introduces a consequence they cannot manage emotionally: permanence. And permanence is terrifying to a psyche that survives by perpetually keeping escape routes clear. You didn't slam the door, you simply walked beyond the horizon, and that is infinitely more disruptive. Here lies the paradox. The avoidant fears engulfment, but they dread irrelevance even more deeply. Being needed feels hazardous to them, but being rendered unnecessary wounds their core identity. Your decisive disappearance compels them to face a painful truth. They were not as indispensable to your emotional ecosystem as they assumed, and that punctures the subconscious hierarchy they were standing upon. That's why they don't merely miss you. They begin to question their own narrative. Their self-concept develops a crack. Because if someone can depart without pursuit, without collapse, without demanding a resolution, then the old comforting story, "I am the one holding the reins," crumbles. And this is where genuine desire can begin to bubble up. Not because you pleaded, not because you made a compelling case, but because your absence injected profound uncertainty into a system that depends on predictability. The avoidant mind cannot tolerate ambiguous endings. They need to believe they could have stayed, could have returned, could have repaired things if they had chosen to. Your silence directly challenges that belief. It suggests the window may have closed without their consultation. And psychologically, that is when attachment truly stirs from dormancy. But here is the more crucial truth you must internalize. This process is not about engineering their return. It's about permanently altering the dynamic. Whether they circle back or not, something irreversible has transpired. You ceased being an option they could safely archive. You transformed into a loss their psyche must now reconcile, and that forever changes how they experience your memory. You didn't force a feeling, you removed the condition that allowed feeling to be perpetually postponed. So if you feel tempted to break the silence, to explain, to soften the edge, to offer reassurance, comprehend what you would be dismantling, you would be handing back the illusion of control, you would be informing their nervous system the potential for loss is still negotiable. Sometimes the most compassionate act you can perform for yourself, and ironically, for them, is to allow the consequence to land fully. Because avoidants do not awaken to the possibility of love through eloquent speeches. They awaken when absence crystallizes into permanence, and they realize too late that they profoundly miscalculated the cost. Now we reach the stage avoidants fight most fiercely to avoid, because this is where everything they've spent a lifetime suppressing finally breaches the surface. Understand this clearly. Avoidants do not lack emotional capacity. They lack emotional endurance. They feel just as intensely, often more so, but they learned prematurely that deep feeling came with penalties: abandonment, overwhelm, or a terrifying loss of autonomy. So they didn't cease feeling. They mastered the art of closing the valve quietly. Your presence enabled that when you were there. They could modulate closeness like a volume knob. A little connection, then distance. A flash of warmth, then retreat. They could graze the emotion without residing in it. But absence removes the control panel. There is no more modulation, no pacing, no emergency exit, and suddenly emotions they've managed for years begin to ascend without authorization. This is where outsiders assume the avoidance simply moves forward. But that is not the internal reality. What's occurring is avoidance without a target. They can't push you away anymore because you're not within reach. So the energy has only one direction to flow, inward. And that is the one territory they have conditioned themselves never to examine for too long. This is when feelings arrive indirectly, not as clear-cut longing at first, but as generalized irritation, persistent restlessness, a hollow sensation they cannot define. They overschedule, they seek distractions, but the quiet moments betray them. Late at night, during small triumphs they would have once shared, in emotional lows where connection would have provided solace, That's when you materialize not as a specific memory, but as a somatic sensation. And with that sensation comes something avoidants detest more than sadness, vulnerability without a contingency plan. They begin to experience emotions they cannot neatly file away, regret braided with relief, curiosity intertwined with fear, longing tangled with shame, because to want you now would mean confessing to a need they've structured their entire identity around denying. This internal conflict generates tangible psychological pressure. Here's the transformation most never witness. This is where attachment doesn't fade, it evolves. Your absence becomes a mirror. It reflects back a version of themselves they briefly accessed in your orbit. Capable of connection, present, emotionally available, and then abandoned. And losing a potential version of the self inflicts a unique pain because it raises a haunting question. What if that was my authentic capacity and I willingly walked away from it? That question has mass. It persists. It shadows them into future, shallower connections, into rebounds that feel hollow, into interactions that lack resonance. You become the contrast, not as an idolized figure, but as the experience of meaning. And meaning is perilous to an avoidant because meaning demands engagement. It calls for honesty. It requires growth. This is where a form of shame enters, not the toxic kind, but an existential reckoning, the quiet awareness that they sabotaged something valuable because they did not know how to remain present. This isn't about punishment, it's about revelation. Your absence didn't break them, it unveiled them to themselves, and now an irreversible line is crossed. They cannot unfeel what has surfaced. They may still resist reaching out. They may still rationalize the story. They may even convince their conscious mind they are better off, but internally a threshold has been passed. Feeling has occurred without their permission. Attachment has been activated without a strategy. And once that happens, the old avoidance playbook no longer functions as designed. Here is what matters for you. Your role is not to manage their awakening. It is not to rescue them from discomfort. It is not to reinsert yourself to ease their process. Genuine growth demands friction, and your absence manufactured it. So if you ever doubt the impact of choosing yourself, remember this: you didn't force them to feel. You simply ceased protecting them from the consequences of their own emotional architecture. Your silence was the ultimate act of self-respect, and in that space, their own heart finally found its voice. If this perspective resonates with you, help this channel grow. Please like this video and subscribe to Winds of Thought for deeper dives into the psychology of relationships and self-reclamation.